We're here to discuss a story by Mark Twain, a late story called The Man Who Corrupted Hadleyburg. And this story was written, as you know, at the end of his career. He'd written Tom Sawyer, he'd written Huck Finn, he was incredibly famous. He was on a world tour in Austria, I think, when he wrote this story. And he wrote it on the stationery of one hotel, suggesting he wrote it pretty fast, kind of impressive. And he was writing in reaction to the Gilded Age. To the American Gilded Age, and to some of the effects of money and the effects of conformism and public opinion on American culture. Now, maybe, Amy, you could start us off by giving us a brief description of what actually happens in the story.
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, the incorruptible town of Hadleyburg, which is renowned for its honesty, manages to offend a stranger who is just passing through. How this happens, we're never told. Bent on revenge, the man, who is the man in the title, the man that corrupted Hadleyburg, sets out on a quest to undermine the town. He deposits a sack of gold with one of the 19 town's worthy families, the Richards, with an explanatory message that the sack contains a gift of gold for the one man in Hadleyburg, the one person in Hadleyburg who one time did him a good turn. He not only gave him $20, which apparently changed his life, but also gave him some advice, which also changed his life, said something which was very, very important. What he said is contained in a sealed note in a message which is inside the sack, which is to go to this person. An inquiry is supposed to be made either privately or publicly. The Richards finally choose to do it publicly. But in very brief, the sack, which is worth $40,000, proves to be a temptation not only for the Richards, but for the rest of the town, whose virtue has never really been tested. The rest of the tale is basically an hilarious account of how the artificial virtue of the town is exposed.
It occurs to me as you're describing this plot, it's sort of a 19th century version of Survivor, when you take a bunch of normal people, Americans, put them in an odd situation, plopping a sack of alleged gold in their midst, and then see how this reveals their character. Now, what are we to make of the town? What is the town when it's described as a virtuous town?
Well, the only virtue that's actually emphasized is that it's an honest town, and more or less everybody agrees. It's honest in its dealings. It's commercially honest, and someone who has grown up in Hadleyburg, it's enough to say I've come from Hadleyburg to have a recommendation for a job if you go elsewhere. It's not a generous town. It's rather tough on strangers. It doesn't give a fig for the opinions of strangers. And at several points, people point out that the town is not only ungenerous, but downright stingy. It's rather narrow-minded. It's rather self-righteous. They are very proud of their virtue, which has been something that they've boasted of for generations.
And are we supposed to take them, you think, as examples of America? Is this Twain saying America's a sort of a smug, narrow, bourgeois society, and that they're examples of it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not clear whether it's examples of America as such, but it seems to me that the town itself is supposed to be anywhere USA. Whether it's our national character that he's exposing, I'm not sure, but he's certainly exposing a commercial town, small town life.
Right. And do that, when you say they have the commercial virtues, are they the descendants of Benjamin Franklin? He was famous for emphasizing exactly these virtues.
With a couple of exceptions. Among the other virtues that he emphasized was humility, which was in which the appearance of the virtue was as good as the reality, but you didn't sort of puff yourself up in other people's faces.
Yeah.
Franklin had a whole list of virtues beyond, in fact, I'm not sure that truthfulness was one of them.
Well, sincerity.
Sincerity, use no hurtful deceit is his maxim.
Right.
But these people, their honesty seems to be confined to business dealings, and one shouldn't make light of it. I mean, commerce depends really on a fair bargain, and that people deliver what they promise, and they keep their contracts and things of that sort.
But just to set this up a little more, the stranger who walks in. The traditional debate about this story has been, is this stranger Satan, who's taking a good town and essentially corrupting it by dropping an alleged money in the middle, or is he an avenging angel who's merely exposing the rottenness which they should have been aware of all along?
That's another wonderful question, and I think there are more than two sides. There's plenty of evidence in the text that it could be Satan. Many descriptions of the stranger, the fire that he carries with him, or the fire that they refer to, or the way in which he has various disguises and portrays himself as dressed up as some kind of strange earl or something like that at the town meeting. The town meeting itself seems to be a kind of devil's mass over which he basically presides finally. So yes, there's a good argument to be made for that it might be Satan. Another argument could be made that the very title, the man that corrupted Hadleyburg, as opposed to the man who corrupted, it's not one man, but it might be human nature itself, which comes to expose itself.
This is a fellow who is certainly not a Christian. He's driven by revenge. It eats him constantly. And he's not content to take his revenge on the one or two people who gave him offense, but he wants to destroy this whole town. And the town has, for its original motto, lead us not into temptation, a verse from Matthew, also part of the Lord's Prayer. And he wants to undo that kind of aspiration. So you could say, I mean, there are people who are envious of virtue or of apparent virtue. They'd like to bring it down. Well, they might be in league with the devil if there is a devil, but it's not necessarily the case that you have to invoke a figure called Satan. I mean, the story does have something of the character of the fall of innocence, not of Adam and Eve here, but of an innocent, untested town. And so there is an analogy to that story, but I'm not sure we need to decide the question as between these alternatives.
Yeah, no, there's ambiguity there. And do we have a theory of why the original sin committed against the person, the man, is never described? And we just know something bad happened. And that may universalize it, I suppose. Or it's sort of an odd omission. It makes you wonder.
The fact that he is described as a mysterious stranger, further evidence for the fact that it might be Satan.
Yeah.
But we're given a hint in what he says in the note that's read, the postscript to the note that's read in the town meeting, about what its purpose was and what actually happened. And it seems that it was the vanity of the town itself, their pride in their honesty and their honest dealings, and the pride that becomes a real vanity that really disturbed him. And it's that he wants to undermine.
And that sort of gets to the third theme I wanted to touch right off the bat, which is an important theme in the story, is the theme of public opinion. And throughout the story, there are people who are wrongly accused in the town, and Richard's one of the main burghers of the town, a bank cashier, I guess, has the opportunity to present evidence which would have exonerated this guy Burgess, the minister. And because he didn't want the town to think ill of him, he did not actually go forward and say, hey, I have some facts about this guy you guys should know about. He didn't want to appear to be on his side when he was out of favor. And this town, the force of public opinion, the conforming force of public opinion, is, in addition to their vanity and their pride, one of the sins that's already sitting there in the town.
The story really powerfully shows how public opinion and reputation, is in a way a dominant consideration in the minds of absolutely everybody in the story. Twain really does a job on this without seeing that, it's not simply terrible to care about your reputation. You wouldn't want to live amongst people in which nobody cared what anybody else thought of them. But in this story, and as we know from experience, public opinion can be tyrannical, and it can get in the way of people doing the honorable thing.
And there's this conformity, but there's actually not a lot of fellow feeling, or what you would call citizenship there.
Exactly.
Because they're sort of kissing up to each other, but the moment in the town meeting,
Right.
when they have a chance to laugh at each other, they take that chance with great relish.
No, there's a fair amount of envy and discontent. Some of the people who are not part of the elite think they deserve to be, and even at the very beginning of the story, when the sack of what turns out to be bogus gold is deposited with the Richards, and she's alone in the house 3 times, she says it's the time for burglars.
Right.
So that they have it's her first thought, yeah. So they have suspicions of one another, at least when they're not engaged in ordinary commercial dealings. But look, well, we maybe you want to talk about this later, but the encouragement really of individualism and the commercial spirit very often leads people to think primarily, narrowly only of themselves. And they will get along with other people insofar as it's necessary, but they don't have really regard for any individual, but they do have regard for the opinion of the public.
Right, yeah. Well, we might as well talk about that. You can imagine that, one of the questions underlying this is, what sort of person does capitalism create? And some people have thought it softens the virtues by, you have to cooperate if you're going to work in a business. You have to have some level of trust if you're going to work, if you're going to do deals. And in those days, and even today, people shake hands and do deals and have reciprocal relationships. The question is whether that's a real fraternity or whether it's simply contractual. And in this town, it suggests they're doing deals, they're trading and selling, buying and selling to each other, but there's no actual fellow feeling. They're simply a bunch of struggling individualists or families without any real cohesion.
But they also are described as, before this event, as being somewhat neighborly. How would they spend the evenings?
That's true.
Right.
They would go visiting their neighbors, and
Right.
it's perfectly clear that everybody knows everybody else.
But I want to press this point about the nature of capitalist relationships, because fundamentally, I'm going to make this point repeatedly, I think Twain is wrong. I think it's an inaccurate portrayal of what America is and what towns are. And I think one of the things he gets wrong is exactly the nature of what capitalism does to people, or what democratic capitalism does to people. And I think people get together for self-interested reasons, but these relationships get enchanted in ways that are kind of profound, and they develop affections. People develop affections for their neighbors, which transcend the capitalist impulse it started with, and actually are quite real relationships.
One of the problems is the state of religion in this town. And I would ask you, how much of your portrayal of the capitalist personality would depend upon religion? But in any case, what we see here is that the Reverend Burgess has been disgraced.
Right.
And so whatever the town once looked up to, if it ever looked up to something higher, is very ambiguous now.
Well, I'm inclined to agree, David, with your view that if this is meant to be a caricature of the American commercial society, it's partial and unfair, the way satire very often is unfair. But I think to join with Amy's point, First of all, I think this is small-town America. This isn't the big industrial society yet, and it's in a way pre-capitalist, or it's a different kind of market. There's the hatter, and there's the tanner, and there's the saddler. There's one of each in the town. So, but second, in addition to the commercial spirit and the reputation for honest dealings, we also have a certain homogeneity of public opinion that is also said to be characteristic of small-town America. Right. There's a kind of self-righteousness that goes with their pride in their own virtue. Right. And they do have a certain, religion is there, but religion serves mostly in the form of public opinion.
Right. I mean, I think we would agree that capitalism has to be embedded in a deeper value system. But I would say, especially in this country, that value system is extremely deeply embedded, and it's not washed away simply because your minister gets disgraced. And so my shorthand version of the American character is that Europeans came here in the whatever century, and they saw vast forests, they saw huge oysters so large they'd never seen them before, they saw flocks of geese so big it took them 45 minutes to take off, and the early settlers would shoot cannon into the flocks just to see if they could redirect them. They were so fascinated by these gigantic flocks. And so two thoughts occurred to these Europeans. One, that God's plans for humanity could be realized here. This could be the final eschatology of the human race. And second, they could get really rich in the process. And so he had intense spiritual and intense material drive. And this moral materialism fused and really has been driving America ever since.
So you think that Twain's depiction of their religion, for example, is really bogus? Or Twain's depiction of a character in small-town America is simply wrong? Yeah.
Well, I think if you want my totally honest opinion, I think he's projecting. Remember, Twain at the time he wrote this story had just lost huge amounts of money on speculation. Throughout his life, he speculated a lot. He was very money hungry. He had this typesetting machine that he thought was going to make him $1 zillion, went bust. He's constantly losing money. And I think he's taking the intellectual's false sense of superiority about a town. And my main beef with the story is that it created the formula that was then recreated by every single novel, movie about American small town and suburban life ever since. Mm-hmm. And the model is virtuous on the surface, rotten at the bottom, and only us intellectuals can see that.
Well, you may be right, but in fairness, I think you'd want to say also that what's on his mind is the emerging national character of our country. This is the time the Associated Press is mentioned for the first time here. Okay, the railroads are coming, so that we're moving from small-town America to a nation that will be united. So what is going to be the character of that?
There's certain ways in which I don't like this story for reasons that you've given, and also because mockery is very easy, and it's we might want to talk about the laughter and what good it does us. Does it simply make us feel superior, or is there a real contribution to moderating our own vanities and our own vices? But again, in fairness to the story, as you say, there are in a way two strands to the early American founding. One is a strand embodied, say, in the Mayflower Compact, that we are here for the greater glory of God. The other is the strand that you find in the individual rights of the Declaration, encouraged by the commercial republic envisioned by Federalist 10 in the Constitution, for material well-being. And the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty and enterprise live side by side, even though in pure form they would seem to be opposed to each other. I mean, the scripture says it's easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle, get through the eye of a needle, than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, what happens in America is religion manages to make its peace with acquisitiveness, makes its peace with it, providing it's done honestly. So Twain is, I think, going after that sort of compromise that religion, with its general suspicion of wealth, has made in America for honest dealings. Honest dealing is in a way where the spirit of religion and the spirit of enterprise merge.
Right.
And the question is whether that's sufficient and whether it isn't precarious when push comes to shove, when temptation appears.
Clearly, there's virtue in the way these, the Puritans would say, our two callings, our religious and worldly calling, have come together. Clearly, there are some advantages to it. In theory, it has a calming effect on the rapacious desires of capitalism. And it probably makes religion probably a little more vital. Our denominations, we have tremendous ability to do a lot of denominations, and they essentially work like small companies competing. We have a marketplace of religion. Now, do you think it's possible to make generalizations when you think about the strengths and weaknesses of this merger of God and mammon? Is it possible to make generalizations about the rules and the specific weaknesses of it that maybe Twain is warning us about?
Twain doesn't give us any rules or show us any rules for bringing together mammon and God. But he does, through laughter, try to make us aware of the tension between those two things. And I think, though we laugh with the people who laugh in the story is hilarious. But we are outside of the story, and we could also see ourselves mirrored in the story, which means that though he doesn't give us any rules, he makes us certainly much more self-conscious about the way we are, both by ourselves as well as with respect to our neighbors.
Yeah. If I wanted to defend the story, I'd say it's not an accurate sociological description of who we are, and I think it's led to a lot of pernicious snobbery. But it may be a corrective. One of the things that American does to religion is it makes religion very happy. It tends to create religions. Henry Steele Commager had a great sentence, and he had wrote a book called, I think, I'm not even quote the name, but he wrote a book. And one of the sentences was, in the 19th century, religion prospered while theology slowly went bankrupt, meaning that we don't really do doctrine very well. Our God is someone who's encouraging, personal, there's very little sin and Satan involved, there's very little evil involved. It's more of a friendly coach telling you to work hard and be a good person. And so we have a tendency therefore to deny our own sinfulness. And he could be reminding us of that, I suppose.
In fairness to the story, before this happens, we're led to believe they weren't all that terrible. They were, as I said before, they were neighborly. They did decent things. There were two churches in the town. There were public meetings. He exaggerates what happens as a result, and it's not exactly, it's perfectly clear that it has to, this couldn't have happened if Barclay Goodson hadn't died. And Barclay Goodson, the name itself suggests, unless God had died. The Son of God had died. So, in part, you're mostly right, but I would suggest there's something more redeeming. And what's redeeming about the Twain really has to do with the laughter.
You don't think that when we laugh at these characters in the story, we're congratulating ourselves because we're not dumb, hypocritical yokels like these people. But he's held up a mirror in which we, in fact, see some of our own pretentiousness, our own vanity, our own trust in our untested virtue. And that reading the story ought to produce a kind of modesty and, is that what you're saying? You take a certain amount of small pleasure in, not so much in seeing the virtue exposed, but in the very comical way in which the people struggle with their conscience until the price keeps going up. And by the way, those things I don't think I feel immune from. I mean, there are temptations to which all of us are subject, and we are periodically tested by incentives and inducements, not necessarily always financial. So, I mean, one sees something of oneself in those stories. I don't particularly like the stranger, though I've got to hand it to him. It's an absolutely ingenious scheme he has for getting them to convict themselves by their own practice. But I'm sort of sad for the town. I'm sort of sad for the town at the end. It's true, and I'm not sure that the new motto that they propose to themselves is an improvement. The old motto of the town is "Lead us not into temptation." The new motto of the town is "Lead us into temptation." I'm not sure that's what you want to really teach your young people.
Right.
So,
Could you expand, because that befuddled me. I didn't understand why Twain emphasized that, changing the motto of the town, what he meant by that, or what it's supposed to mean.
Well, they were raised from the cradle to believe that they ought never to be led into temptation.
Right.
That's what they're told from the very beginning. That seems to be, or at least this kind of, without being tested, that seems to be what makes them succumb so easily to the first temptation that comes their way.
I see.
So you change the motto from "lead us not into temptation" to "lead us to temptation," because temptation, only by being tried and tested will your virtue really emerge, something like that.
but I think it's got to be also a certain dig at a kind of Christian teaching. I mean, this is at the heart of the Lord's Prayer. Basically, the town previously seemed to be echoing the prayer. That was what was left of the Lord's Prayer in this town.
Right.
Now they've decided that wasn't helpful. And it's certainly true that untested virtue, it may be hollow and may be artificial. Mary Richards says herself, "I'm a humbug." Everybody in this town is going to be shown to have an artificial virtue when the temptation comes. And it's true, people have to face the things and learn how to deal with them as a psychological matter. But I think there's a doctrinal question here that's being attacked, and the town becomes anonymous. We don't know where the town is. It sort of has taken a new name to avoid its previous disgrace, and it's now going to encourage people to have temptations. And you could say, I mean, maybe you could say, look, America has followed the new model of Hadleyburg all too well.
Right, and so Vegas is our new model, because there's a lot of temptation in Vegas. Presumably, is that supposed to improve us?
What are you saying? 3 cheers for hypocrisy?
Actually, I'll give 2. I think hypocrisy, La Rochefoucauld says, is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And I think you'd much rather live in a community in which there was public scrupulosity and some private corruption. Then if you lived in a community in which everybody was vicious and they made no bones about it. I mean, there's something... Look, there are things wrong with the town as caricatured, but I'm not sure the town has been improved as a result of having abandoned its aspiration to be virtuous.
Well, you both have said that one of the problems with the town is that the minister is in disgrace or gone. So how do we understand a minister's good influence on a town? Is it through what you've just said suggests that you don't have much faith in sermons? That if he gives a sermon once a week, that'll have a huge effect. So those are just words that fly over your head. How could a minister possibly have had such a good effect?
Well, there's a mystery in this story about the minister. I mean, if we stay first with the story, then we can generalize it.
And there are 2 churches.
There are 2 churches on the public square: a bank, a town hall, the Presbyterian church, the Baptist church. The minister is accused of doing something we know not what, of which he was innocent.
Right.
And as a result of that, the town turns against him, and he'll never get another congregation. And yet he sort of presides over this meeting. He gives a kind of sermon-like speech which rouses the faithful to their own reputation. in fact, he's a rather generous soul in the story.
Right.
I mean, he repays a kindness by lying
Yeah.
for Mr. Richards, so that Richards is not disgraced with the rest of them. And he's repaid for that kindness by being vilified by Richards
Right.
in the end.
Yeah.
But it seems to me the minister has force partly by moral example.
Right.
And in this case, he apparently seems to have lost it undeservedly.
Right.
He has some force insofar as his speech speaks to the better angels of people's nature and gives it encouragement and lifts their gaze.
Right.
And that seems also to be on tenuous grounds in the community. But people need to give voice to the things that they, in a way, already believe and already practice. But the speeches by themselves, I don't think, can do it.
Let me mention a different theory of moral development as a way to get into the subject we mentioned earlier, but should come back to, which is the subject of public opinion and conformity in America. Now, another theory of moral development is Adam Smith's theory, which is that we don't behave morally because God tells us or sermons. We behave morally because people around us sort of reward us for it. We're liked better. And then, so he has a problem with this theory is, well, if you're surrounded by Nazis, they'll reward you for behaving badly. And so his answer is you should imagine an impartial observer who would be the person you would like to observe you. Now, people in this town are acutely interested in the feelings of opinions of others. And while I think this story is very bad sociology, I think it's pretty good psychology. Mm-hmm. And he gets the effect and the roiling effects of this. And so Tocqueville thought this was a particular American problem. Adam Smith may have disagreed. Do you think Tocqueville's right about this, and this story is an example of an American trait, or is it a universal trait about public opinion?
Tocqueville's argument rested on a society that was founded on equality. And I think he's dead right. That when he describes the philosophical method of Americans,
Yeah.
he talks about how they look to themselves as authorities. We don't look to other people or great authorities. Okay, so that because we don't look to other people as great authorities, public opinion takes on a greater authority than it ought to. And I think that's the way it works. And I think there are numerous examples in contemporary America. There were certainly efforts in the Constitution to moderate this tendency. Certainly the commercial republic was supposed to do something about this, to multiply the number of interests and so on and extend the republic. But finally, public opinion matters, and it matters a lot. And you see this from the newspapers every day.
Right. Is this because our status is insecure? If you're Alexis Tocqueville or Lord so-and-so, no matter what you do, you're still a lord. Whereas for us, it's our own behavior. We can rise or fall to the top, to the bottom, depending on behavior. Is that the essential issue with it? Or is it equality or is it meritocracy? That may be a better way to ask it.
I think it's probably come to be a mixture of both. But under democratic times where we don't think anybody else has more purchase on the truth of things than we do, and yet we can't really sort out everything for ourselves, we tend to give much more weight to the opinion of the majority. And that's both good and bad. I mean, there is the danger of the tyranny of the majority. It wreaks havoc on unconventional opinion, which is sometimes better than that of the multitude. It makes it difficult for the nonconformists, for artists, among others. On the other hand, to say again, public opinion is where mores exist and are taught, and it's not unimportant for civil peace that we don't violate those opinions. And very often those opinions are carry, in a way, the moral teachings, the norms, and the standards of the community. So you don't want to teach your children. Your mother will say, if everybody jumps off the roof, are you going to jump too?
Right.
When they say what everybody else is doing. On the other hand, you also don't want to teach them to have contempt for the opinions of the people that they have to live with. That's a kind of moderate position. It's difficult probably to negotiate.
Right.
That's very important. You don't want to teach people to live in the opinions of others.
Right.
On the other hand, you don't want them to ignore the opinions of others.
I mean, I want to add to what you said about Smith. Smith placed a great deal of weight, and he really was, I think, intending to provide a kind of moral theory for modern capitalist society. And the theory of moral sentiments is at least as important a work, and it's a companion work to The Wealth of Nations. The point of departure is not some arduous virtue. The point of departure are certain ingrained natural feelings that we have sympathy.
Right.
And that's why, going back to something you said at the beginning, it's probably wrong to say of small communities that they're only animated by selfish, narrow interests.
The one thing that is really off in the Twain story is the way in which this community deals with strangers.
Well, it's
Not caring a rap for strangers.
The quality of sympathy in a town can differ. I mean, the famous contrast is the one I think Edward Banfield and Robert Putnam made between small towns in Italy and small towns in the U.S. And in Italy, there was tremendous social trust within families, but not so much trust outside of families. And so when they would start a company, they would hire all their cousins, but they couldn't grow because they couldn't hire anybody but their cousins because they didn't fundamentally trust them. In the United States, they hire, we feel no problem, we're suspicious of hiring our cousins because we actually know who they are. So we hire vastly outside. And so I do think it's characteristic of the United States that we do tend to hire and do tend to assimilate strangers phenomenally well. But could you go back to the Tocqueville on the equality? When we think of this town, is it an equal town? Would we say there's equality in Hadleyburg?
Right, there's an equality of opinion, but there's clearly a difference and some resentment about the difference between the 19 notable distinguished families and the rest of the town.
there are different social classes and there's economic inequality, but it's clearly recognizable as a democratic American town. And you have the town meeting, the people mix it up, no one is shy about speaking his mind or defers to anybody else in the town. So if the crucial thing about equality is not the equality of result in terms of income or status, but the equality of thinking that I'm as good as anybody else in this town when it comes to deciding how I should live my life or what I should believe, I think this is a recognizable Tocquevillian American town.
I think that point is well taken.
Yeah, and the equality and the individualism go together. I mean, it's the equality which encourages people to rely upon themselves alone, to turn in a way inward, to think primarily about their little nexus. And I think we see that here.
Right. Okay. And then to conclude, let me ask one final question. So many of the stories and essays in What So Proudly We Hail are historical, like this one, 19th century. And Tocqueville came here in 1830s. America is very different now, demographically, economically. Is it your basic belief that the America Tocqueville described in the 1830s is essentially the culture we live in today, and these stories are germane because we're essentially living in the same culture, or is it an entirely different nation?
So I think I would be inclined to say that notwithstanding many of the changes, technological, sociological, political, there's still something recognizably American that has to do with the remarkable interweaving of strands which ordinarily pull away from each other. I mean, we hold many things together. In fact, the motto, out of many, one, applies not just to the states and not just to the individuals in the whole, but to the various strands, often conflicting, that are held together here. Do we have something like a concern with the dominance of public opinion that we should think about? Yes. Is there a way in which materialism and the commercial spirit leads us to be forgetful of community or higher things? There's a danger of that. Do we take an excessive pride in our presumptive virtue, which may or may not hold good when we are tempted? Yeah. What is the nature of our communities if we basically think of ourselves as rights-bearing individuals? Or what kind of strength does our somewhat watered-down religious teaching have? I think those are still pertinent concerns, even if Twain is dead wrong as a sociologist about a particular town. Right. But the issues that you can tease out of this story, and the psychological ones that you mentioned, those may be not peculiarly American, they may just be human nature.
The Twain story, among several of the others, really reveals or exposes some elements, crucial elements in human nature.
Right.
And that doesn't make it distinctively American, but it takes on a kind of American twist in these stories. What is it? What are the virtues or vices that all human beings have at whatever age they're in, that emerge or are exposed by the particular arrangements that we have?
We've been discussing the Mark Twain short story, The Man Who Corrupted Hadleyburg, in the wonderful anthology, What So Proudly We Hail, with Leon and Amy Cass. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
David.
you.